Blood runs down Dutch Hawthorne's weathered cheek as the machines keep him breathing, but his hand grips something that makes the nurses step back in confusion. A small brass key, so tightly clutched that his knuckles have turned white. When they try to remove it, his eyes snap open and he whispers a single word that freezes everyone in the room. Sophia. The doctors say it's normal for stroke victims to ramble about the past. But Dutch hasn't spoken that name in 40 years. Not since the day his wife Margaret threatened to leave him if he ever mentioned it again. But who is Sophia? And why does Dutch keep reaching toward the window that faces the mountains every October 15th? Caleb Driftwood sits beside his grandfather's hospital bed, torn between respect and burning curiosity. The old man who raised him after his parents died in that car crash has always been private about certain things. But this is different. This feels like a secret that's eating Dutch alive from the inside. The brass key weighs heavy in Caleb's palm now, warm from his grandfather's desperate grip. It's attached to a leather keychain worn smooth by decades of handling. And scratched into the brass are coordinates that point deep into the Colorado wilderness. The worst part isn't that Dutch is dying. The worst part is what Caleb found hidden in the ranch house attic yesterday, while looking for legal documents. A wooden box buried under moth-eaten blankets, filled with 40 years of calendar pages, each one marked with the same circled date, October 15th. Beside each marking, Dutch had written 2 words in his careful handwriting, going home. But the ranch has been home for 60 years, so where was Dutch really going? Caleb's hands shake as he remembers what else was in that box. A faded photograph of Dutch standing next to a woman who isn't Margaret, both of them young and smiling in front of a cabin Caleb has never seen. The woman is pregnant, and Dutch's hand rests protectively on her swollen belly. On the back, someone wrote, "Our new beginning, October 15th, 1983. The math makes Caleb's stomach turn. Dutch was already married to Margaret in 1983, already had Caleb's father and Aunt Martha. The machines monitoring Dutch's vital signs start beeping faster, and his eyes flutter open to focus on Caleb's face. For a moment, the old man looks lucid, present, like he's fighting through the fog of medication and brain damage to say something important. His lips move silently, then form words barely above a whisper. "Tell her I'm sorry," Dutch breathes. "Tell her I kept my promise. Every year, just like I said I would." His eyes close again, but his free hand reaches toward Caleb with desperate urgency. The cabin, October 15th. She'll be waiting. Tomorrow is October 15th. After 40 years of secrets, Dutch won't be making his annual pilgrimage, but someone needs to go in his place, and that someone is holding the key to a truth that could destroy everything Caleb thought he knew about his family. Caleb sits in Dutch's pickup truck outside the hospital, staring at the coordinates etched into the brass key until his eyes water. Going to that cabin feels like betraying the man who raised him, but not going feels like abandoning him when he needs help the most. The photograph burns in his jacket pocket, that image of Dutch with a pregnant woman who isn't his grandmother. A woman whose face carries kindness and pain in equal measure. Someone who clearly loved Dutch enough to pose for pictures in front of a cabin that doesn't exist on any family property. The drive back to the ranch should take 20 minutes, but Caleb finds himself pulling over on Mountain View Road, his hands shaking too badly to grip the steering wheel properly. 40 years. Dutch has been carrying this secret for 40 years, making annual trips to see someone important enough to risk his marriage and family reputation. But what kind of promise requires a man to disappear into the wilderness every October 15th for 4 decades? Caleb's phone buzzes with texts from his Aunt Martha, asking about funeral arrangements, and his Uncle James wanting to discuss the will. Neither of them knows about the box in the attic or the key that's cutting into Caleb's palm from gripping it so hard. They're planning Dutch's death while Caleb holds evidence of a life they never knew existed. The weight of that knowledge sits heavy in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He drives to the ranch and climbs back into the dusty attic, this time searching more carefully through boxes Dutch thought no one would ever find. Hidden beneath Christmas decorations and old tax returns, Caleb discovers a metal lockbox that opens with the brass key. Inside he finds something that changes everything. A birth certificate for Sophia Elena Hawthorne, born October 15th, 1983. Mother's name, Elena Vasquez. Father's name, Theodore Dutch Hawthorne. Caleb has a sister. Had a sister. The birth certificate is followed by another document that makes his blood run cold. A death certificate dated February 18th, 1984. Sophia Elena Hawthorne, age 4 months. Cause of death listed as pneumonia, complicated by severe weather conditions. The address on both documents leads to coordinates that match exactly with the numbers carved into Dutch's key. A folded newspaper clipping falls from between the certificates, yellowed with age. The headline reads, "Local rancher loses infant daughter in mountain blizzard." The article describes how Theodore Hawthorne carried his sick baby through 6 miles of snowdrifts, trying to reach medical help before a winter storm blocked all mountain roads. By the time rescue workers found them, the child had died in his arms. The mother, Elena Vasquez, was treated for exposure and grief, but declined to be interviewed. Caleb's Aunt Martha has never mentioned having a sister who died. His Uncle James has never spoken about a baby in the family. Either Dutch never told them, or the family agreed to bury this tragedy so deep that it disappeared from their history entirely. But Dutch never forgot. Every October 15th, he returns to the place where Sophia was born and died, carrying letters he's never had the courage to send. The coordinates point to a location 40 miles into the wilderness, accessible only by an old mining road that hasn't appeared on maps for decades. Tomorrow is October 15th. Someone is waiting for Dutch at that cabin, and Caleb is the only person who knows about it. The mining road into the Colorado wilderness hasn't seen maintenance in decades, and every pothole feels like punishment for violating Dutch's privacy. Caleb grips the steering wheel until his knuckles ache, fighting the urge to turn around and pretend he never found that lockbox. But Sophia's death certificate sits on the passenger seat beside him, a constant reminder that some secrets are too important to leave buried. 3 hours from the ranch, Caleb's cell service dies, and the GPS signal fades to nothing. He's navigating by compass and the coordinates carved into Dutch's key, following tire tracks that could belong to anyone. The rational part of his mind insists that no one will be at the cabin after 40 years, but something deeper whispers that Dutch's promise meant more than annual solitude. Someone has been waiting for him all this time. The forest closes in on both sides, pine trees so thick that noon feels like twilight. Caleb passes the rusted remains of mining equipment from another era, twisted metal slowly being reclaimed by nature. This is the kind of place where people disappear without a trace, where cell towers can't reach and rescue teams never think to look. Dutch made this journey every year until he was 78 years old, driven by grief and guilt that never faded. When the coordinates finally match Dutch's key, Caleb finds himself in an empty clearing surrounded by aspens whose golden leaves whisper secrets in the mountain wind. But the tire tracks continue past the clearing, following what might have been a trail decades ago. Someone has been maintaining this path, keeping it clear of fallen branches and washouts. Fresh tire marks in the muddy ground suggest recent use, maybe within the past week. Caleb follows the trail on foot, his boots slipping on wet leaves as the path winds through dense forest where afternoon light barely penetrates the canopy. Every step takes him further from civilization and deeper into a world that belongs to Dutch and someone named Elena Vasquez. The woman who loved his grandfather enough to have his child. The woman who lost that child in a blizzard while Dutch was still married to another woman. After 20 minutes of hiking, the trail opens into a smaller clearing, where a cabin sits like something from a forgotten dream. The structure is older than Caleb expected, built from logs weathered to the color of ash, but someone has been maintaining it carefully. New shingles patch the roof, the windows gleam clean in the filtered sunlight, and smoke rises from the stone chimney in a thin gray line that speaks of recent use. Caleb approaches slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. A wooden rocking chair sits empty on the covered porch, still swaying slightly as if someone just stood up. Fresh tire tracks circle the cabin like a defensive perimeter, and the tread pattern matches heavy all-terrain tires, not the worn treads on Dutch's old pickup. Through the clean window, Caleb sees movement inside the cabin. A shadow passes in front of the fireplace, deliberate and human. Someone is home, and they've been expecting company. As Caleb climbs the 3 wooden steps to the cabin door, he realizes that Dutch's promise wasn't about visiting a grave or maintaining a shrine. It was about keeping an appointment with the living. Caleb knocks on the cabin door 3 times before a woman's voice calls from inside, speaking words that make his blood freeze in his veins. "I know why you're here, Caleb," she says through the wooden door. "Dutch told me about you in his letters. How you look just like he did at your age. Stubborn as a mule and twice as curious. You can come in, but I want you to understand something first. Once you hear what I have to say, there's no going back to the life you had before." The door opens to reveal a woman in her early 60s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that carry 4 decades of carefully contained grief. She's wearing work clothes that have seen better days and boots caked with mountain mud. When she speaks again, her voice carries a slight accent that sounds like it comes from New Mexico, or maybe southern Colorado. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she says, studying Caleb's face with an intensity that makes him uncomfortable. "Your grandfather wrote me a letter every year for 40 years, but he never sent a single one. He brought them here instead, to this cabin he built for me and our daughter before everything went wrong." Elena steps back to let Caleb enter, and he sees that the cabin's single room is arranged like a shrine to memory. Photographs cover every inch of the far wall, some in color, others black and white with curled edges that speak of decades spent hidden from light. Most show the same woman at different ages, but Caleb recognizes Elena in pictures spanning 40 years. In the center of the display hangs a photograph of Dutch holding a baby with unmistakable blue eyes. Dutch never told his family about Sophia, Elena continues, settling into a wooden chair positioned to face the photograph wall. "He wanted to, especially after your grandmother died, but the guilt was too heavy. He blamed himself for what happened to our daughter, and he thought carrying that burden alone was his punishment." Caleb approaches the photograph slowly, drawn to images of a life he never knew existed. There's Dutch looking younger than he ever remembers, building this very cabin with his own hands. Elena pregnant and radiant, unaware of the tragedy that would soon tear their world apart. Baby Sophia taking her first steps on this wooden floor, chasing shadows while her parents watched from the doorway. "I read the newspaper article," Caleb says quietly, "about the blizzard, about Dutch trying to carry Sophia to safety." Elena's face hardens with old anger. "The newspaper got it wrong. Dutch didn't lose our daughter because he was careless or unprepared. He lost her because the weather service missed a storm system that brought 3 feet of snow in 6 hours. He carried her through drifts up to his chest for 6 miles in whiteout conditions, and by the time he reached the main road, his lips were blue, and his hands were so frozen he couldn't feel his fingers. But Sophia was already gone." She stands and walks to the window overlooking the clearing where wildflowers grow in patches of afternoon sunlight. "Dutch blamed himself for bringing us up here in the first place. Said if he'd been a better man, if he'd chosen his family over his desires, none of it would have happened. I tried to tell him that sometimes terrible things happen to good people, that love doesn't guarantee protection from loss, but he couldn't hear it. So he came here every year," Caleb says, understanding finally beginning to dawn. Elena nods, tears threatening to spill down her weathered cheeks. "Every October 15th, on Sophia's birthday, he'd read her his latest letter and promised to be the father she deserved, even though she was already gone." Elena moves to a wooden table where a stack of unopened letters sits bound with red ribbon, each envelope addressed in Dutch's careful handwriting. The paper has yellowed with age, and some of the ink has faded, but every letter is dated October 15th, with years spanning from 1984 to the present. "Dutch was married to your grandmother when we met," Elena says, her fingers tracing the top envelope. "I was working as a nurse in Boulder, and he came in after a horse kicked him in the ribs. We tried to fight what was happening between us for months, but some feelings are stronger than good intentions. When I got pregnant, Dutch wanted to leave Margaret and marry me, but I couldn't let him destroy his family for a mistake we both made." Caleb sinks into a second chair that Elena has pulled out for him, his mind struggling to reconcile this story with the grandfather he thought he knew. Dutch had always been devoted to Margaret, faithful and steady as the mountains themselves. The idea of him having an affair feels impossible, but the photographs on the wall tell a different story. "Why didn't you contact him after Sophia died?" Caleb asks. "Why let him carry this alone?" Elena's smile is bitter and broken. "I tried. After the funeral, I drove to his ranch and parked at the end of the driveway, working up the courage to knock on his door. But I saw Margaret through the kitchen window, pregnant with your father, and I realized that Dutch had another family to protect. Another child who deserved a father without scandal following him around, so I left Colorado and never looked back." She opens the most recent letter, dated October 15th of last year, and reads silently before looking up at Caleb with tears in her eyes. Dutch's handwriting got shaky over the years, but his message never changed. He'd tell Sophia about the family she never got to meet, about Martha becoming a teacher and James taking over the ranch, about you graduating college and coming back to help with the cattle. He was so proud of you, Caleb. He wrote about you more than anyone else. "How did you know he was in the hospital?" Caleb asks, the question that's been nagging at him since Elena opened the door. Small towns have long memories, Elena says. I moved back to Colorado 5 years ago, after my husband died. I've been living in Copper Creek, about an hour from here. When Dutch didn't show up on October 15th for the first time in 40 years, I knew something was wrong. I called the hospital in Denver and asked about Theodore Hawthorne. The nurse said he'd suffered a stroke. Elena stands and walks to the fireplace where a small fire crackles against the afternoon chill. Above the mantel hangs a baby blanket, hand-knitted in soft yellow wool. I've been coming here every October 15th for 40 years too, hoping Dutch would finally find the courage to talk to me instead of just leaving letters. We were both stubborn, both carrying guilt that belonged to winter, and bad timing instead of failed love. Caleb feels the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. His Aunt Martha and Uncle James have no idea that Dutch had another child, another life that ran parallel to theirs for 4 decades. They're planning his funeral while the woman who shared his deepest grief sits in a mountain cabin, mourning alone. What happens now? Caleb asks. Do I tell my family about Sophia? About you? Elena returns to the table and picks up Dutch's final letter, the one that will never be read to a daughter who died too young. That's your choice to make, but I want you to know that Dutch loved your grandmother, loved his family with you and Martha and James. What happened between us doesn't diminish that love. Sometimes the heart is big enough to hold more than one truth. Caleb spends the next hour reading Dutch's letters while Elena prepares coffee on a wood-burning stove that looks like it hasn't changed since the cabin was built. Each letter reveals more of his grandfather's pain, written in a voice Caleb has never heard before. Dutch writes to Sophia about his regrets, his failed attempts to forgive himself, his desperate wish that he could have saved her. But he also writes about hope, about watching Caleb grow into the kind of man Sophia would have been proud to call her brother. He mentions you started coming back to Colorado 5 years ago, Caleb says, looking up from a letter dated 2019. The same year my grandmother got sick. Did Dutch know you were here? Elena sets 2 steaming mugs on the table and settles back into her chair. I saw him once, at the hardware store in town. He was buying fence posts, and I was getting paint for my new house. We made eye contact across the store, and for a moment I thought he might walk over. But then Margaret appeared beside him, sick and fragile, leaning on his arm for support. I realized he was already carrying all the grief he could handle. Caleb understands the weight of that moment, the choice Elena made to stay silent, while Dutch's world crumbled around his dying wife. Margaret had battled cancer for 2 years before pneumonia finally took her, and Dutch had never left her side. Adding the pain of Sophia's memory to that burden would have been cruel. My Aunt Martha thinks Dutch changed after Margaret died, Caleb says. She says he became distant, like he was carrying something heavy. Now I know why. Guilt has its own gravity, Elena replies. The longer you carry it, the heavier it gets. Dutch thought he was protecting everyone by keeping Sophia's memory to himself, but secrets like that eat you alive from the inside. I should know. I've been carrying the same weight. Elena walks to a trunk near the fireplace and returns with a manila envelope filled with documents. Inside, Caleb finds medical records from Denver General Hospital, dated February 18, 1984. The attending physician's report describes Dutch's condition when he arrived: severe hypothermia, frostbite on both hands, and emotional shock. He'd collapsed in the emergency room parking lot, still clutching Sophia's body, refusing to let anyone take her until the doctors forcibly sedated him. The nurses said he kept apologizing to her, Elena says, her voice barely above a whisper. Even unconscious, he was saying he was sorry over and over. When he woke up 3 days later, I was sitting beside his bed. He looked at me and said the only words he spoke for a week. I failed her. Caleb feels tears building behind his eyes as he reads the medical report. Dutch had risked his own life trying to save their daughter, had nearly died himself in the attempt, but still blamed himself for her death. 40 years of annual pilgrimages to this cabin, 40 years of letters that said the same thing in different ways. I'm sorry. I failed. I should have done better. He never failed her, Caleb says, his voice thick with emotion. He loved her enough to build this place, to carry her memory for 40 years, to risk everything trying to save her life. How is that failure? Elena reaches across the table and covers Caleb's hand with her own. That's what I've been trying to tell him in my own letters for 4 decades. But sometimes the heart holds on to pain longer than it holds on to logic. Your grandfather was a good man who loved deeply and blamed himself for things beyond his control. What am I supposed to do with this? Caleb asks, gesturing to the photographs and letters that surround them. How do I go home and look at my family the same way? The sun begins to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, where Caleb sits surrounded by 40 years of his grandfather's deepest secrets. Elena has given him space to process everything, but he can feel her watching him from the kitchen area, where she's been quietly washing dishes and organizing Dutch's letters into chronological order. I keep thinking about my Aunt Martha, Caleb finally says, breaking the silence that has stretched between them for 20 minutes. She's Dutch's oldest child, and she's been planning his funeral like he was just a simple rancher who loved his family and kept to himself. She has no idea that her father had this whole other life, this whole other grief that he carried alone. Elena sets down the dish towel and turns to face him. Martha was 5 years old when Sophia died. Dutch made the choice to protect her from that pain, to let her grow up without the shadow of a sister she never knew. That was his decision to make, and it came from love, not shame. But what about now? Caleb asks, his voice rising with frustration. She's 50 years old. Uncle James is 47. Don't they deserve to know that Dutch wasn't just wandering off every October 15th, that he was honoring the memory of their sister? Elena joins him at the table, her weathered hands folding together in her lap. They deserve whatever you think is best for your family. I'm not asking you to keep Dutch's secret or to reveal it. I'm just grateful that someone finally knows the truth, that Dutch's story won't die with him. Caleb looks around the cabin one more time, taking in the photographs of a baby he'll never meet and the letters that his grandfather poured his heart into for 4 decades. This place is a monument to love and loss, a shrine to the kind of devotion that most people never experience. Dutch built this cabin for Elena and Sophia, then maintained it alone for 40 years, as a way of keeping his promise to never forget. He told me in the hospital to tell someone he was sorry, Caleb says, understanding finally dawning in his voice. He wasn't talking about the family back home. He was talking about you. He wanted me to come here and tell you he was sorry for all the years he stayed away, for all the letters he never sent, for carrying this pain alone when you were willing to share it. Elena's eyes fill with tears, and she nods slowly. Dutch was always proud, even when we were young. He thought bearing this burden alone was somehow noble, that it proved his love for Sophia was pure. But grief shared is grief lessened, and love shared is love multiplied. I would have gladly carried half his pain if he'd let me. Caleb makes his decision then, looking at the woman who loved his grandfather enough to wait 40 years for an apology that never came. He pulls out his phone and scrolls to his Aunt Martha's number, his thumb hovering over the call button. Elena, he says, his voice steady with new resolve, would you like to come to Dutch's funeral? As his friend, if that's easier than explaining the whole truth. My family should meet the person who knew the best parts of him, the parts he thought he had to hide. Elena covers her face with her hands, and Caleb realizes she's crying, not from sadness, but from relief that finally, after 4 decades of silence, Dutch's story will be honored by the family he loved enough to protect. When she looks up, her eyes shine with gratitude. I would be honored to say goodbye to him properly, she whispers. And maybe, if the moment feels right, I can tell them about Sophia, about the love that brought Dutch to this mountain every year for 40 years. The funeral takes place 3 days later, under a Colorado sky so clear it seems like Dutch arranged the weather himself. Elena sits in the 3rd row of the small country church, wearing a simple black dress and the same boots she wore at the cabin. Caleb introduced her to the family as an old friend from Dutch's past, which is true enough without being the whole truth. Martha and James accept Elena's presence without question, both too grieved to wonder about strangers who claim to have known their father. But during the service, when the pastor asks if anyone wants to share memories of Dutch, Elena stands slowly and walks to the front of the church. Theodore Hawthorne was the most honorable man I ever knew, she begins, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. He taught me that love isn't just about the good times. It's about carrying someone in your heart long after they're gone, about keeping promises even when no one is watching, about choosing to bear pain alone if it means protecting the people you love. Caleb sees his Aunt Martha lean forward, studying Elena's face with new interest. Something in the older woman's tone suggests deeper knowledge, a connection that goes beyond casual friendship. Elena continues speaking, her words careful and measured. Dutch carried a sorrow that most of you never knew about, but he carried it with dignity and grace. Every year on October 15th, he would visit a place that meant everything to him, a place where he honored a love that was too private to share, but too important to forget. He was a man who understood that some kinds of devotion happen in silence. James and Martha exchanged glances, finally understanding why their father disappeared every October for 40 years. Elena reaches into her purse and pulls out a small photograph, the one that shows Dutch holding baby Sophia. "Your father had another child," Elena says gently, her voice filled with 4 decades of carefully contained love. Her name was Sophia, and she died when she was 4 months old. Dutch spent 40 years visiting her memory, writing her letters and making sure she was never forgotten. He loved your family too much to burden you with his grief, but I think it's time you knew that part of his story. Martha starts crying before Elena finishes speaking, not from shock, but from relief. She stands and walks to the front of the church, taking the photograph with shaking hands. "I knew there was something," Martha whispers. "All those years, I could see the sadness in his eyes every October. I thought it was about Mom somehow, but it was about our sister." Elena nods, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He loved you all more than his own life. Sophia was never a replacement for your family. She was just another piece of his heart that he kept safe in the only way he knew how." After the service, Martha and James walk with Elena to the cemetery where Dutch's headstone is still covered with fresh flowers. Elena places a single yellow rose beside the others and whispers words only she and Dutch would understand. Caleb realizes then why his grandfather carried that brass key for 40 years, why he never missed a single October 15th, why he whispered apologies even in his final moments. Dutch had kept his promise to Elena and Sophia, honoring their memory with the kind of devotion that most people never experience. The annual visits weren't about guilt or regret. They were about love that transcends time, distance, and even death itself. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.